Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. My name is Uzma Rizvi, and I am an associate professor of anthropology and urban studies at Pratt Institute. In my role as chair of the board of the anthropology section, New York Academy of Sciences, I want to thank all of you for joining us from all the various places and times you may be from. This evening in New York City, we are excited to present our final segment of our 2020-2021 programming on reimagining resilience and our distinguished lecturer series, a talk by Professor Yolanda Moses entitled Anthropological Perspectives on Race, Nation, and For Whom is America Great? After the talk, Professor Moses will be joined by board members Stephanie Rupp and Christine Hagel for a conversation in which we will all engage with the themes of Dr. Moses's talk and open certain questions up for discussion. Of course, in order to ensure all of this programming can happen, we rely on grants and sponsors. And so I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the Wenner Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and Bergen Books for supporting the anthropology section. Equally significant is the board of advisors for our section, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the many hours of work done by our board members on these events. Given that this is our last event, I wanted to publicly acknowledge by name the board for their work throughout the year and express my gratitude for all the unseen service and labor that they have all engaged in. Joining me on the executive committee is Vice Chair Matt Riley and our treasurer Ryan Rome. On our board, and this I'm going to do in alphabetical order, is Mima Shinalo, Pat Antonello, Christina Baines, Ugo Benavides, Marian Bergen, Anne Marie Cantwell, Shahrinath Chaudhry, Veronica Davidov, Donna Ann Davis, Khadija Ferryman, Christine Hagel, Carol Henderson, Megan Hicks, Louise Lamphere, Hannah Lessinger, Betty Levine, Bill Mitchell, Stephanie Rupp, Danilyn Rutherford, Nina Glickschiller, and Lotte Silver. And we are joined by our anthropology section fellows, Anna Sergeyeva and Miriam Leitner. Without all of them, none of this would be possible. And so I just want to say a big public thank you to all of you. For those of you in the audience, you should know that we will be live tweeting during our event at NYAS_anth, that's ANTH. So if you are so inclined, please do join the conversation there. To become part of our growing community, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the same handle at NYAS_anth. You can like our webpage on Facebook, join our email listserv, and become part of our vibrant community of anthropologists. Finally, throughout the course of the webinar, you can post questions in the Q&A section, the question and answer section on the lower bar of your Zoom menu. And if you're on YouTube, in the comments section, we will be collecting the questions and comments throughout the program and hope we can get to as many of them as possible through the course of the panel. Now, in case of a breach of security, which has never happened, but we just want to be prepared, we have a secondary Zoom ready, and it will take about 10 minutes for a relaunch. So please check your emails for the link. In case something does happen, we will shut down the program immediately and then send everyone a different link. I would now like to introduce our distinguished lecturer, Professor Yolanda Moses. Yolanda Moses currently serves as Professor of Anthropology and former Associate Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Excellence at the University of California, Riverside. Dr. Moses's research focuses on the broad questions of the origins of social inequality in complex societies, using comparative ethnographic and survey methods. She's explored gender and class disparities in the Caribbean, East Africa, and the United States. Most recently, her research has focused in on issues of diversity and change in universities and colleges in the US, India, Europe, South Africa, Israel, and Australia. Moses has served as the president of the American Anthropological Association between 1995 and 97. She was chair of the board of the American Association of Colleges and Universities in 2000. And she's a past president of the City University of New York, the City College, between 1993 and 1999, as well as having served as president of the American Association for Higher Education between 2000 and 2003. She's also been a member of the Board of Trustees of the Ford Foundation between 1996 and 2008. There's actually a lot more service and work that Dr. Moses has done that we're just so so in awe of. Her service has not only been in such leadership positions, she's worked at every level to integrate a critical understanding of race, gender, and class into the various infrastructures of the Academy. She's led one of the most influential online projects within anthropology, understandingrace.org. She was the chair of the National Advisory Board of this multi-year national public education project sponsored by the AAA and funded by NSF and the Ford Foundation on Race and Human Variation. The goal of the project was to change the way the nation understood and talked about the meaning and consequences of race. And I know that this is something many of us use in our teaching. Recipient of numerous grants from the Ford Foundation to NSF, NEH, she has tirelessly advocated for the role of women faculty in STEM throughout all of this work. And she's worked to create a national educational network for educators to develop a biocultural approach to the teaching of race in high school and in undergraduate social science and biology classes. And we're hoping to speak to her a bit about this later on this evening. Her publications are numerous. Perhaps she's most well known for her co-authorship of the book, How Real is Race? A source book on race, culture, and biology, and Race, Are We So Different?, which was just published by Wiley Blackwell. As you may imagine, Yolanda Moses has been the recipient of numerous awards and recognitions as well. I will name but a few here so that we just get a taste of her many achievements. In 2009, she was named the American Association of Advancement of Science Fellow. She received the American Anthropology Association Franz Boas Award in 2016 for distinguished service to the field of anthropology, and has been awarded Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Association of Black Anthropologists and the Society for the Anthropology of North America in 2016. And again, as I keep mentioning, this is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the immense distinguished career that her CV demonstrates. Needless to say, we are honored to have Yolanda Moses with us here this evening. So with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Yolanda Moses to present her lecture, Anthropological Perspectives on Race, Nation, and For Whom is America Great? Professor Moses, if you would turn on your camera. I wonder if we're having a technical issue. Professor Moses? Let's see. There we go. And can you unmute as well?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yes. Hello, everybody, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Uzma. I really, now I understand why I'm tired sometimes. I am going to share my slides with you, and I think I'm having a technical problem with sharing my slides with you. Here, let's see. This was just the thing we didn't want to do, right?
Oh, it's fine. I think we've all been doing this now for so long that we're all okay with it.
Yeah.
There we go. You got it.
All righty. So what I want to talk about today, and I love the discussion too, are anthropological perspectives on race, nation, and for whom is America great? And we've been inundated in the news with admonitions that, oh my gosh, there is something called structural racism. What is that? And how did that happen? Well, I think we're in a great place as anthropologists to talk about the unfinished business of uncovering racism and racism in the United States. And I would say that these relations are more fraught than ever because of that misunderstanding. So what I want to do in the time we have today is to look at this systemic racism and to make an arc between what has happened in the past to now. You all know about the 1619 Project, and I'm sure many of you use it in your classes. But for so many Americans, they think the past is past and that we're in a different world almost when it comes to race relations. We know that's not true. How to do it and the role of anthropologists in making this disruption. And finally, closing down, calling my conclusions the beginning, because I think we are all on a journey here together as anthropologists. I believe we have a lot to say, a lot to teach America, and how we go about doing it, I think is going to be very, very important. So the unfinished business of race and systemic racism in the US. Uh, the Trump administration did not start anything new in this country, as you all know, but was tapping into an already deep-seated set of racial and racist beliefs, policies, and practices that date back to the founding of this republic 400 years ago or more. And the resurgence of racial antipathy and oppressive policies surface on a regular basis if we look at American history of our nation. And we can witness this through the number of slave revolts, through the number of race riots, through the number of laws and policies and practices that have been put in place to this country to keep the other in their places here. Race riots, massacres, lynchings, and activities that come about in this country when there is a perceived threat to white social standing at all levels in this country. So there is an arc from the past to the present in that regard. And since the history of the United States is not taught the way it should be taught, or that we would probably teach it, I think this is a good place for us to go back and begin to bring that arc forward in our work. One of the things we wanted to show in the Race Are We So Different project in our publications is that white supremacy and structural racism are baked into the myths and the narratives of this country, and that the US has always been perceived by people in power as a country for white people. The Declaration of Independence, the US Constitution, the ultimate structure of our government with its tripartite system attests to the power dynamics of white elites from the slave-owning colonies to hold on to their economic commodities at all costs. And these commodities are both land and people, right? So the structure of our current Senate and House of Representatives attest to the fact that by counting the bodies of slaves and Native Americans as 3/5 of a person, the Southern colonies could have the body count, the numbers they needed to maintain power in the Southern states, both in the House and in the Senate. This is not something that's taught in our traditional history classes. There was always a fear on the part of planters in the South that the slaves would rise up and revolt against them. What happened in Haiti in 1803 was a wake-up call for a lot of the planters in the South. So the policing and the fear of Black bodies is nothing new in this country. And if we look at the before and after the mid 1600s, we can see the fluidity in how labor was considered in colonial America, that there was a way out of bondage, particularly for some of the earlier slaves, as well as the white indentured servants that came to this country. Whereas after the mid 1600s, slavery became more ingrained, and there was no possibility of freedom for African slaves, and white indentured servants could still become free, but laws were developed to prohibit their cohabitation, their engagement, their involvement. And eventually, a lot of these indentured servants became the white working class that populates the South today. And so we see this racial hierarchy that was set up a long time ago. So one of the things I would say is that even though some of the people felt that slaves were human beings, many of them did not. But the laws of our land were put in place to keep people in bondage. And at the very heart of this democracy, think about that, is a contradiction about race and racism and systemic racism that has not been resolved today. And that is something that is a genealogy or a legacy that has to be claimed and dismantled, and the myths around it, in order for us to move forward, in my opinion. That's one of the things we have to do. Now, I have found useful thinking about racism in this country historically connected to economics and property as a way to teach people how to understand about the larger picture. And the idea of formation, nation formation, and in colonialism around issues of race and property is really important. This book, Colonial Lives of Property, that looks at law, land, and racial regimes of ownership, talks about how people can go from being individuals to becoming property and then become treated the way you treat the land. And to own it, lock, stock, and barrel, and to use it any way you want is not an idea that was born out of whole cloth here in the US. The people who came from Britain brought that notion with them, which had been embedded in British society for hundreds of years. And so there was a tradition of property and property ownership that came with the original settlers that still have a toehold here in the US in ways that are, that put things before people, property before people. There's a value system that still is operative, and bodies of people of color are still considered, if not property owned, not like us. And so are the other, the different, if you will. The planters had a right to fear insurrections. And we don't have a lot in our American history about insurrections. People did not like being enslaved. So from 1526 to 1864, there were documented 313 slave revolts. And in Virginia, the state of Virginia, there were over 84. So you see, there was there is in the thinking of who we are, how we maintain our status, we must protect ourselves. And one way to protect ourselves is to police those boundaries of who is and who isn't an American. So those kinds of notions started back in those days. And if you look at this map, which goes to 1864, you see that there were a lot of unorganized territories. And each of these territories as they came into the Union, had laws about who could be citizens and who could not be citizens. And African Americans, Native Americans, Chinese Americans, back in the day, could not be. And there were laws and regulations about what they could and could not do. So woven into the warp and woof of who we are as Americans, there has always been a guardedness around the activities of people who were not white in this country. Even those people who were anti-slavery, the abolitionists, they felt morally that slaves should be free, but none of them wanted slaves, the freed slaves, to be their neighbors, to live near them. So that is also a part of that. So during the excuse me, oh, I'm going backwards, sorry. So here's a timeline stamped from the beginning, and that's taken from Kendi's book. This is not, but I like that title, Stamped from the Beginning. The History of Race and Racism in the United States. You can see how in the colonies, expanding to a new nation, the whole Reconstruction period, Jim Crow era, 1964 to the present, these were all periods of growth, but also demarking who's in and who's out, who's a citizen, who's not, who can be an American, who cannot be American, regardless of what they do and who they look like. So stamped from the beginning. When slaves were freed in 1865, during the short Reconstruction period, when Black males were told they could gain the right to vote and to participate in the governing process as a part of their freedom, the laws again shut them out. Even they shut them out, and they portrayed them as people who could not govern themselves or rule themselves. The idea to, because of the federal laws, to become representatives, but they were caricatured. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed man, not African-American man in the 19th century, because he understood how you are portrayed is going to have an impact on how people see you. So beginning of media, right? And when these men became a part of the Reconstruction members of Congress, they were painted by some of the same people who had painted Frederick Douglass for that reason, right? Now, here's how they were portrayed in the popular press. Some of you may know the publication Condé Nast. They produced a magazine called Harper's. This is out of Harper's Magazine. And it portrayed these members of Congress as thieves, liars, rascals, and cowards. They were caricatured. They were not seen as people who were able to represent their countries. And we know how short-lived Reconstruction was, but part of it was already this embedded belief that even though slavery was finished, these people were not civilized. These people could not be civilized. These people were not human in the same way we are. There are things they can do, but they cannot rule us. They cannot govern us. They cannot live with us at our same level. Now, during the colonial period and during Western expansion of white settlers, based on the notions of manifest destiny, indigenous people were also dehumanized because white settlers believed that God had ordained that they would settle the United States. And this belief that God had ordained it and the fact that the federal government reinforced it solidified in the minds of these people, particularly the veterans, working class, poor people who had fought in the Revolutionary Wars and the War of 1812, 1912, 1812, they were promised land. Well, whose land were they promised? They were promised land that people already lived on. Well, that didn't matter. In Georgia, for example, the Cherokee adopted the civilized lifeways of white people and were summarily kicked off their land and were a part of the Trail of Tears because it didn't matter that they were going to church or civilized, had become Christians or whatever. The government wanted their land. And so they were declared just the same way that caricature went from the noble savage, they were characterized as being heathens and as being people who were not fit to live with white people because you couldn't trust them and they would kill you if you turned your back. So you couldn't live side by side with them. You couldn't farm next to their farm. And the government sanctioned it, and thousands of these people were moved. And on that Trail of Tears journey, 3,000 of those people died. Now, let's juxtapose that. You see this trail, you see the trail that started over here in Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and how these folks ended up over in Oklahoma. So they were dehumanized and racialized and unfit to live with white people, and they were removed. And today, this trail is maintained by the National Park Service, and millions of people traverse these trails, hiking and what have you, not knowing who had traveled these trails, who had died on these trails, what it meant to summarily pick up populations and move them because of who they were and what they looked like. This is part of that legacy that has to be told. So it was sanctioned by the government that this took place. Later in the 19th century, when immigrants from China were imported to build the Transcontinental Railroad, they were also seen as outsiders, not worthy of citizenship rights. So by the time, and again, manifest destiny, they helped build the Transcontinental Railroad. Many of them ended up on the West Coast, which had not become states at all. But already there was an aristocracy of color that was being developed or had been developed, where race was reconstructed in the Midwest and on the West Coast the same way it had been on the East Coast. So moving into new territory didn't mean new ideas, new ways of inclusion. No, it meant maintaining the same hierarchy of race and opportunity. And in the case of American heathens, religion again was used to talk about why these folks were not fit to be citizens. And it comes down to who is an American, who can be American, citizenship. And we all know about the Chinese Exclusion Act and how that impacted people coming. Chinese were some of the earlier folks to be involved in the gold rush, but were summarily kicked out when the white miners got there, as well as Native American miners and mestizo miners, because this was considered white people's land. So anything on this land belonged to them. So by the early 20th century, when the Europeans came, Eastern Europeans and Southern immigrants, who incidentally were not initially considered white because of the great chain of being and where they fit in on that paradigm, right? There were hundreds of federal laws and thousands of local laws across our country that determine restrictions about who was considered non-white and what rights they had, as well as what they could and could not do in terms of movement. And by that time, there were sundown laws in many places where you would never think you would have them, whether you were Black or Native American or recent immigrant. When the sun went down, you had to be out of town. And this included restrictions on citizenship and voting rights. So the idea of being outnumbered by the unwashed hordes of Black and brown folks, as well as people who did not speak English, has always been a part of our national narrative, both the front stage and the backstage of that narrative. So the deep-seated paradox of racist hierarchies that sit at the heart of our democracy is over 400 years old. The basic question at the founding of the United States, and the question that I want us to grapple with today, is what is the United States? And who are Americans who live here, and who gets to decide? What is new about 2021 is that white supremacy is now used by the mainstream political right, for example. The slogan, "Make America Great Again," and white supremacist groups have moved from the dark corners into the daylight again and at the center of our country. From 2016 to 2020, our country was subjected to forms of xenophobia, racism, misogyny, homophobia at the highest levels of government. This had an impact. We had a leader that intentionally stoked the long simmering fires of racial animosity, just smoldering under the surface of a country that has yet to acknowledge its settler colonial and oppressed settler colonial past and its oppressive systemic racism past. So there is a reason there is a major tension in our country today. And this time it's between people who say, we want the good old days, and those Americans who say, it has never been good for us, but we want to make it so. So when the headlines of our newspapers and streaming platforms talk about structural racism in our social institutions as if it were a new phenomena, anthropologists know better. Whether it is reports on the carceral state, the plight of government-sanctioned policies that separate parents from children, the shutting down of refugee programs or asylum programs, and just the shambles of our immigration policies in general, anthropologists know better. We know the myths of the United States as a nation of immigrants. For not all people who came to this country were immigrants, as there were people already here when the first Europeans arrived, people who had already been here for thousands of years. This land was not terra nullius. And this is where the genealogy of whiteness comes in, because it's the same kind of pattern, similar pattern that happened in Australia and in other places that were colonized by British or the descendants of British folks. So it is time for anthropologists to tell our nation's history and our nation's story in a way that allows people who do not know that story of how we got to this place in our nation's experiment to know it, and that we are at a critical inflection point as a democracy. Can we become that pluralistic democracy that our myths tell us that we already are? Can anthropologists tell that story of America? who we were then and who we are today. That story has to be told. Can we document the embeddedness of structural racism and other structural oppressions for wider audiences not familiar with the intersections of racism, power, and hegemony in a country that professes equality before the law? Do our current anthropological theories around structural oppressions, such as historical and contemporary racism and the cultural arc that connects the two, tell the story to each other, our students, and our communities? I suggest that perhaps they do tell that story, but my question is, can we tell it better? Can it be better told? Can it be more powerfully told? For example, how do we link everything that we see today to an ethos that is often unspoken and unseen, but drives everything? I am talking about what happens when capitalist patriarchy, white supremacy, misogyny, homophobia, and the belief in 21st century manifest destiny, on the one hand, meets BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color populations, LGBTQ populations, transgender populations, non binary populations, young enlightened white allies, old enlightened white allies, new immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and others on the other hand. Oh, yes. And in this latter population, that tend to be shifting our national demographics, this population tends to support more liberal political and social ideas and are beginning to vote. So you see the tension. So it means that as anthropologists, we are situated at the right place and at the right time in academia, wherever we work professionally, and with our work with activist communities, change agents to work toward building a sustainable anti-racist nation based on our knowledge and our research and what we teach, and to be the nation that we want to be. How do we do that? And this is where I am proposing that we do that through what I'm calling disruption. Disruption and revisioning. And I'm suggesting one way that we can do this, not the only way, obviously, it's through the lenses of white supremacy and racist capitalism, bringing those two things together. The definition of the word disruption, according to Collins, is when an event, system, or process is prevented from continuing or operating in a normal way. And that's exactly what we want to do. We want to disrupt the way the narratives are and the systems that are operating around structural racism. Through our research, teaching, and professional practice, we have to disrupt the ways that knowledges are created and communicated around systems of oppression, especially looking through the lenses of white supremacy and white and capitalist racism. Racial capitalism is a term that comes from Cedric Robinson, a social scientist, who describes the process as extracting social economic value from a person of a different non-white racial identity. And it can also mean to extract those that value in a system or institution that is dominated by a particular race, to extract that economic value. And according to him, the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist societies, by in and of itself, capitalism produces a system that systematizes race and racism. It is built into the system. So if we think about dismantling racism here in the United States without thinking about capitalism and its the role that it plays, then we're missing the boat. And it also allows us, and one of the things he's done, he's looked at Black internationalism. He's looked at anti-Blackness worldwide. What you see again is that legacy where there has been colonization and extraction of resources in a system. There has been structures created to do that and to create hierarchies of people in almost caste-like ways, right? Where they can't get out of it. And so he's saying to think we're not a part of that, even though we came late to the dance. For example, slavery had been instituted in Latin America and in the Caribbean, 200 years before it was here in the US. He said, we are doing exactly the same thing here. So in summary, our research and practice as anthropologists moving forward should continue to look critically at how these systems of power and inequality operate in everyday life. For example, we could make transparent the more nuanced understandings of the historical structural origins of race and wealth accumulation. In the press recently, there's been a lot of talk about, the wealth gap between Blacks and Latinos and whites in this country. Well, this is not about individuals. This is about systems that have colluded for generations to make this happen. Wealth accumulation means you have the ability through your own drive or through privilege or through systems that allow you to do this. Well, we know that systems have not allowed Black and brown folks to do that. We must continue also to focus our energies in research into the nature of health and educational disparities as systems of inequality and injustice, rather than focusing on individuals or groups. And you can see this with the COVID-19 pandemic. Oh, well, these folks are getting COVID because, well, maybe they're not living in sanitary conditions, or maybe they just don't care, or maybe they just are, their constitutions, they are built, they're naturalized so that they get sick more than other people, rather than looking at how structural inequalities have hit poor people, BIPOC, immigrant, older people that are often poor, and other marginalized groups. And we must revisit the why of these things. Why do we keep putting that burden on individuals and not on the systems that helped create them? The last example I want to give is what happens when a government has control of how they construct their country through laws. The last administration wanted, they didn't do it, but they wanted to change the 14th Amendment. Remember the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment? The 14th Amendment, so that people born in the United States from non-citizens could not be citizens. Now this was in 2018 or 19 during the Trump administration, but it has come up in our nation's history at those times when citizenship and who can be a citizen have been on the national agenda. It didn't happen because there was a hue and outcry, but it was something that was proposed. So the idea of what still needs to be done. Anthropologists must look at the unfinished business of laying bare and eradicating the willful ignorance and blindness around structural racism in this country. But I will put to you, to eradicate structural and systemic racism, we need structural and systemic solutions. And our research can help to fuel that. And our teaching and our engagements with other people can help to do that. In some ways, the conversation, like the conversation we had with the Race Project, was designed to explain race to a general public, what it is, what it isn't. But we only touched the surface in that project. There is so much work to be done, the unfinished business of doing that work. As other critical lines of research and practice, I would like to suggest that anthropological and multidisciplinary research that you are perhaps currently doing, we need to continue that and look for ways to intersect our research that we're doing to present a more holistic national picture of how these various research strands that we are doing as anthropologists intersect at a national level. So I'm kind of suggesting, to be fruitful, that we look at the following multidisciplinary research areas, because for me, the Race Project came together the way it did because we worked with historians and economists and legal scholars and biologists and geneticists to come together to talk about what needed to be done. So one of the areas are intersections of race with other social dimensions, the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, and I was reading article by Sherry Ortner that talked about triangulation, that intersectionality intersects sort of one thing at a time, whereas triangulation, you can look at at least three ways that that people are intersecting in terms of social dimensions. The second area, race, racisms, and immigration. Looking again at the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments and how they play out in the lives of different groups and populations of people who can be an American, how that works. Here in the US, we're looking at DACA, the away some of their rights. This current administration is allowing them to continue in schools, but the reality is they have no long-term issue. There is no long-term immigration strategy here in the United States, and that can be researched and recommendations can be made in terms of policy. What are some of the policies that could work in these kinds of situations? Another big issue, explaining how race, racism's policing, and the state are interlocked now and linked to a long legacy of criminalizing BIPOC bodies. We talked about this earlier in the legacy. Imagining, if we think about policing of Black bodies since the very beginning of this country, we understand how criminalization works and how there's collusion between the state and local government to do that, and corporations. So there's a lot to be done there. in that area, examining the genealogies of whiteness, white supremacy in the past to better understand the present in the US and elsewhere. Britain, South Africa, Australia, and Canada used the same race science, used our same race scientists to make their cases in their country. Critical analysis of the impact of the changing national demographics and how they will disrupt historical power relationships and racially constructed social hierarchies of the past. It will happen. It is happening. How do we document that? Finally, a critical analysis of the continuing educational, housing, and health disparities that impact BIPOC people disproportionately. That is happening as well. And finally, as my time is running out, I want to say that as professionals, researchers and educators, we can work toward designing research, curricula, organizing classroom experiences, and collaborating with teachers and students and interested citizens to learn about race and racism. The context can also communicate current science of human variation. The notion of race is about culture and not biology, and the long history of racism in this country. Most importantly, issues of gender, class, power, and wealth need to be combined with any discussion of race. I couldn't possibly cover all the aspects of institutionalized and structural racism in this presentation. However, I did want to point out the links, both observed and nuanced, between the biological, historical, and the everyday ways in which everyone experiences race and is raced in the United States. And I have suggested a few research and practices, ideas around what the next phase of how and what I think anthropologists, teachers, museum specialists, and community members could be doing to promote an even deeper anthropological understanding of race and systems that continue to create it in service to a transformational change here in the United States so that we can create the kind of country that we want. Thank you.
Oh, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Moses. I'm always so amazed by your ability to bring in sort of in the conversation larger concepts and questions like, what is the United States? What is our role? And then tangible issues and provide insights into ways kind of forward. One of the things that's really standing out to me is, in some sense, what's anthropology's charge if we want to make these changes that we absolutely need to make, as you were saying. When we were putting this year's theme together, we had many of the questions that you've raised in your talk this evening. And so in that sense, again, it's absolutely fitting that you're the final speaker, because we really do want to talk about the unfinished business of what needs to be done. So rather than having a discussant for the talk, which is what we usually do, we thought, given the topic and because you've done such a beautiful job setting the stage for this conversation, that rather than having a discussant, we would have a discussion. So I'd like to invite two of my colleagues from the board, Stephanie Rump and Christine Hagel. So together we might imagine a way forward from Yolanda's talk. And I'd like to remind the audience at any point, I know some Q&A, some questions are coming in, but please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen, and we're going to integrate your questions into our conversations. And so with that, I just want to invite both Stephanie and Christine. And Yolanda, if I could ask for you to
Yes.
stop sharing. That would, I think, help.
Oh, okay. Very good.
Great. So Christine or Stephanie, would you like to start us off with the question? There's so much. This was such a rich conversation. And I think I want to also encourage the audience to feel like that their questions are part of this conversation as well. So, but I'll hand it to you both first.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for this amazing talk. And it's certainly a lot to chew on and a lot of good food for thought. One of the things I'm thinking about is something that you bring up near the end of your talk, where you talk about how It is our charge, and it's important for us to create spaces where students and interested citizens can learn about race and racism. Um, and I think that this highlights an issue that's all too common on either side of the partisan divide, right? We're often in a position of preaching to the choir, right, amongst ourselves. And so then the question becomes, how do we find ways to interest the disinterested, right? And whether that disinterest is mild or profound, it's often laced with fear. And so when we consider that space of disinterest, how do we enter that space effectively? What models do we have to do this well, right? It's your project, Understanding Race, is so wonderful in that it's geared towards students who, and the public, but I think for, a lot of them have teachers or encounter that material, right, in an educational setting where they are not necessarily seeking it out, but where it's introduced to them by some person in their life, a teacher or a parent or whatever. But what about average everyday citizens who are disinterested? How do we bridge that divide?
I think we intentionally go into the lion's den. And by that, I mean, I think we intentionally understand what it is that makes them disinterested. And we say, you are not just implicated in this, but you are racist as well, that it affects everybody, whether you know it or not, and the very ways in which they are. And in the very beginning, I talked about what happened when the laws became very strict and the indentured servants and the slaves could not interact because they were building coalitions in some ways because they were in similar situations. But when they become or don't see their interests together,
Mm-hmm.
then they can start blaming each other for what's not right with their own life. But if they're in it together, they can see that. For example, and I'll give you another example in the 30s and 40s, when Black folks were used to break strikes, and they were willing to come in and work for less, and they were willing to get beat up to cross the lines and what have you, because that's all they had. Well, it wasn't until poor white workers realized that having them in their unions was a way to build camaraderie and for them to see what it was they had in common with each other, so that there was a solidarity. What they were both fighting was a system that kept them both at a certain level. But if you believe that because your white skin color gives you a privilege, even with people you don't see anything you have in common with, you're not going to see that. And I think this is a reason that race versus class became the way as a nation we moved forward. Because if we started looking at class, the way class is taught and looked at in other social fields and what have you, we would see that there's a lot in common. Now, there have been some recent publications. Actually, there was a whole journal in 2017 that AAA did on white working class people. Arlie Hochschild's book about white working class people and why they think the way they think. I think we have to understand that. And then we have to figure where we enter in that to understand how to get folks to see that. And I'm just talking off the top of my head right now because you asked me that question, but you have to see a common kind of project. And right now, it's sort of going that way. So if you can kind of talk about how working class folks in these towns and cities that are dead, this has nothing to do with immigrants. It has everything to do with the corporate class leaving the community, abandoning people, leaving them. And, you know, those are the kinds of things that I think. Oh, and the other thing is, we have to learn how to write to the popular press. And that means op-ed pieces. It means articles that, how do I say it, that explain things, but in language that ordinary people can understand. Because we have a holistic way of looking at systems and how they interact that I think average people can understand if you do it that way.
Yeah. I'm just going to jump in here just because you've brought this up now, this question of whiteness, right? So
Yes.
I'd like us to talk just a bit about whiteness for a minute if we can. So
Sure.
I think there has to be, and I think this is what you're leading us to kind of think through is thinking and understanding whiteness beyond white supremacy, right? And I think earlier, Christine and I and Stephanie, we were having a conversation about your recent article in Sapiens. Why do we keep using the word Caucasian? Right. And so I was wondering if we could take what you just have kind of unpacked for us and then perhaps speak to how this might relate to a conversation about whiteness that disentangles the violence of supremacy and allows for a certain kind of heterogeneity of white experiences. And it's difficult because there's so much white privilege globally prescribed to whiteness, you know, like I'm just thinking from a colonial context and in other ways. So I wonder if there are ways forward to make certain types of radical changes that we want to see. Like you're giving us some ideas of like how to do it, but like there are like there's something that has to be done, and we're all struggling to find what it is that we need to do here. So we're kind of looking to you to kind of open that up just a bit, if possible.
Well, clearly, all white people are not the problem.
Right. Exactly.
There are groups of white people, just like there are groups of everybody else who have certain kinds of status and privilege. But if you don't understand your place in this history, in this firmament, how you have been perceived by power elite, status quo, whatever, we know in the beginning of this country that only people who had property, could read, had class position, could vote, regardless of what color they were. So a lot of the yeomen and the overseers and people like that, they didn't vote either. And so the idea that you are a part of this system, what is it that you're getting from this that keeps you happy? What makes you not happy? And what makes you not happy? Can you see that in other places? For example, people can come together in coalitions to make things better in their communities if they see there is a common kind of problem that is being shared. And once people get to know each other as individuals, and this is where the individual level does come in. It's like, I remember I grew up in Southern California in the early 60s in a city that is now 100% Latino, which was 100% Black, that was 100% white, and it's called Compton. And in that neighborhood where we grew up, it was a working class neighborhood that was multiracial. What we had in common was the fact that all the parents worked either as factory workers or domestics. And the kids, we kind of played together, you know, we did stuff together. There was something that we all had in common. But with segregated housing, with segregated schools, with the barriers and the borders that are built around us, we have to be intentional about tearing some of those down. And one of the places, or several of the places that this happens automatically are in our schools. And so that's one of the reasons we focus on teachers in schools. And we had almost given up on the older generation. We said, they're not going to get it anyway. But what we found out from teachers is that they didn't know any of this stuff. And they didn't know how to teach their students. And so we took another step back and said, what are they learning in teacher ed? And so there's, again, graduate school. So the graduate schools aren't teaching teachers how to teach these things. And so there are a lot of ways that we can enter that. If we think about what do we do, where are the places or the spaces where we can create community, where we can share those things that we have in common, those things we don't like, things we like. And if it comes at the individual level from citizens, from people knowing each other as people, and it doesn't happen if you live in segregated America. What you see is what you see on TV. What you see is what you see reading the newspaper or see on your feed or whatever. But if you don't have any friends who are of other groups, then it's going to be hard for you to do that unless you're intentional about figuring that out for yourself. In the workplace, it could happen under the right circumstances, but one-off workshops don't work.
Mm-hmm. Yolanda, this is a great place for a question that I have to ask you. This is a perfect,
of course, Stephanie,
perfect transition. No, it's great. It's so fruitful, and it's really helpful to think this through with you. I mean, we are at a historic moment where we have sort of a historic reconvergence of violences against people of color that pull together the communities that you so eloquently historicized in your presentation. And we're in this sort of condensed cataclysm of conflict around the kinds of issues that you have spent your life studying. So we have so much to learn from you. I'm curious about this question of the community of the classroom. And I have a note to myself to come back to your idea of revisioning, because you have disruption in your talk and revisioning. And disruption got more attention than revisioning. And so I'd like to ask us to revision through education and to see how, as communities of learners and collaborative learners, we can see ourselves and our communities and our nation through others' eyes and through each other's eyes, right? So that in the space of a classroom, you can have students, and maybe even our very youngest students, using anthropological methods to really study deeply about themselves and their lives and their society and how they fit into it. So one of the initiatives that the anthropology section is currently developing is a partnership with public schools in New York City to introduce anthropology to elementary school kids. And in fact, we think we could do this productively all the way from the very youngest grades up through high school. And we're interested in seeing how anthropological methods can amplify the New York State curriculum for social studies. And it's interesting, when you dig into the New York State curriculum, there are several social studies practices that they have at their pedagogical core, which they don't realize it's kind of like an anthropologist toolkit, but it's in there. It's things like gathering, interpreting, and using evidence, chronological reasoning and causation, we saw that tonight, comparison and contextualization, geographic reasoning, economics and economic systems, and civic participation. And I think if we take your talk as like a model for anthropological inquiry, we can check all this off and we say, these are the skills we would love to foster in school kids, right? Anthropology is studying what it means to be human, and our youngest people are human and have the tools and should be developing the tools to study what that means. So we'd like to ask you to dream with us about how we do this and think for a minute. You have your fascinating framework for bringing biocultural anthropological understandings of race to high school students. How could we do this for first graders, like first first to fifth graders, what are the kinds of methods that you could imagine bringing to our youngest scholars so that they can critically analyze race in their lives, who they are, how they fit into school, what they mean to each other, what they mean to their families, their neighborhoods, and what are the ways, you just brought it down to us to the individual level, which is so helpful. So how do we empower our youngest people to have this critical inquiry from the very beginning in a collaborative space where they have shared experiences and can learn from each other? And that maybe this is a way of breaking down the walls of partisanship and silencing and invisibilizing other people's experiences.
Wow. Wow. Let me say I think you all are on the right track in the sense that if there's anything that's going to change in how you integrate with the school system, you're going to have to understand their frameworks, their teaching framework. So the fact that you have analyzed that and you would bring in materials that would work. I can tell you a couple of things that we did with the project. We have, I don't know if it's still online, but we had online a workbook for parents to talk to their kids and for kids in junior high school, I think, anyway, there are some exercises online that you can look at for small children. But as you know from the Brown v. Board of Education case and the DAW project, that young people see race or see skin color at the age of 4. And they are inquisitive. So you can talk to them about difference and similarities and in ways that they go, oh, okay. But if you don't have the words or the tools to tell them, then they store that and they start to see there's something here that is different and I don't understand it. So maybe what people are saying to me, like what I'm hearing at home, what I'm seeing on TV, might be what's real versus what is happening in the classrooms, because kids are getting their information from more than one place, but they listen to their parents and they listen to their teachers and to a certain extent their friends. So to the extent to which these communities can become organic and young people are exposed to activities that allow them to develop their aha moments around science too, that there is a science behind why people's skin color is different. And it has to do with where they have historically lived, where their ancestors lived. And so you give them concrete ways to understand that versus myths or misinformation. The problem we found with a lot of the teachers were that they didn't have that kind of background to teach it that way. They only said, well, we all have to get along. And, it was a more of a social justice kind of framework, which is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't answer those deep questions where the students themselves can be equipped with tools so that they can build on their own knowledge and learn more about an issue like, where did you come from? Where did your folks come from? And so we had little tiny exercises, I think, where we had children, draw pictures of their families, and do things like that and share them with each other. What are the things you guys like to do? What do you like to do? What do you like to do? A lot of the things are similar, but there are some things that are different, like religious practices and that kind of thing. And it's like, this is what we do in our house. This is what we do in our house. And it's like, oh, okay. And it's amazing how non-judgmental these young people are when they're engrossed in talking about themselves, but also learning about their friends and what their friends are doing. And I think that early is we can start that, the better. And again, those are just my thoughts. I'm sure if I thought about it a long, long time, I might come up with some other ideas. But these kids are open and eager. They want to know. But we don't know, from where they've come, what has been taught to them at home. In some ways, the earlier you can get the kids, the better, because some of them already have a mindset by the time they get to first, second, and third grade. They've seen people killed. They've been through trauma. They themselves are grappling with poverty, gross poverty. And it's like you have to ground what you're talking about in their realities so that they grasp and understand it. So I hope that's a bit helpful.
Yeah, I actually, there's a question in the Q&A that links with this to some extent, just in terms of thinking about this problematic of education, of changing mindsets. And it's focused on, not on children, but on educating adults.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll read you the question from Ruth Wangerin, which is, I'm very interested in the poor understanding of race in medicine. How can we introduce it to medical training? I'm not just talking about silly racist ideas or unconscious bias among practitioners. Otherwise, highly educated medical researchers are still using race as a variable and feel superior to social scientists who tell them there's something they don't understand. They sometimes claim it's the best way to factor in differences in genetic ancestry, as if that's accurate enough. Or they sometimes claim it's just a marker for a constellation of socioeconomic factors. Of course, there are people in the health field working on racism, social determinants of health, etc. Can we see a way to get anthropologists more involved in medical school training?
That's a very good question. And there are places around the United States where anthropologists are involved with medical school training. One of them is at University of California, Riverside, where I am. We have a medical school that is that's about 10 years old, maybe 12 years old now. And it's one of the latest medical schools to have come in existence in California, because it was designed to serve underserved populations. And it is in an area which is east of Los Angeles in the Riverside and San Bernardino counties that have disproportionate number of poor people that live there, and they are terribly underserved. So that was the reason the state of California gave us the funds to get started with this medical school. So the medical training itself is designed to train doctors who will serve in these communities. So the traditional medical model does not fit, if you get my drift. So what we have done, and I can put the person in touch with the dean and the people who've done this curriculum. We have anthropologists embedded as faculty in the School of Medicine, and they're teaching the first and second year courses around certain issues of healthcare. And it's almost as if the people in the medical profession have discovered this word disparities. And it's a euphemism, right? They don't say racism, they say disparities, because it sounds, I guess it sounds more lenient, or it's not as harsh on the tongue, I don't know, whatever. But to the extent that the American Medical Association and the National Endowment for Health and the National Academies of Science and Medicine are now starting to recognize systemic racism, you're going to see some changes, because those are the organizations that give grant and money for research. And medical schools want that money. It's not necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts that they want to change. And I'll tell you one thing that happened that I think as anthropologists, we can continue to build on. When the race exhibit was at the Smithsonian, the head of the Smithsonian, what's his name? Does somebody know his name? Not the Smithsonian, the National Endowment, the National Institute of Health. The guy who did the human genome. Anyway, he asked if he could bring medical students and researchers to the exhibit so they could see and understand, as they were putting their research projects together, how important it was for them to understand how systemic racism worked. Now, that was about 5 years ago that happened. And now the calls for the calls for grants and what have you have that word disparities built into it. So they're asking for people who know how to do this, and they're asking for teams that are put together with social sciences, like anthropologists, to be a part of those teams. So that's one way that I see. And then enlightened deans in medical schools can have a lot of influence too. And I would say medical schools now have diversity deans and people who are monitoring these issues. So there will be some changes.
So, Dr. Moses, we have a couple of questions, 2 more questions for you. And then
Okay.
I'd like to just let all of the participants know that perhaps we could compile the other questions that have been asked for you to read. And you can have them as thoughtful engagements with your fabulous talk and this wonderful conversation, so that you know how many other interesting areas that people are raising behind the scenes. And we realize we're approaching 8 o'clock and we don't want to overstretch anybody beyond whatever time zone they're in. We know that we should be respectful of time. So we thought we would take just 2 final questions. One is very interestingly practical. An anonymous attendee asked, how do you see the role of forgiving student loans in the US? Currently, if you default on your student loans, you cannot gain access to your official PhD transcripts, nor do you have the right to access your Social Security benefits once you turn 65. What can we do to change these 2 types of policies? And I think this is an interesting question because it addresses the systemic inequalities in our system from a very practical point of view. And there may be multiple reasons why people cannot afford to repay their student loans. And it may actually connect with, very expensive educational background, programs like medicine or law. And
Right.
there's some paths that allow you loan forgiveness, and there's some paths that don't. And I wonder if you have some thoughts on one of these sort of very practical policy solutions towards rectifying systemic inequalities in education.
Yeah, I mean, I think if institutions are, excuse me, interested in inviting in minoritized populations or underrepresented populations into their programs, then they should understand that there are systemic issues that may prevent these individuals from having the same kind of trajectory that a more ordinary student would have. And I think there should be exceptions built into policies so that institutions walk their talk. And it's one thing to give lip service to wanting to do the right thing. It's another to understand the kinds of situations that come up structurally that you may encounter in bringing these students into your institution, and you should be ready to address those institutionally and not say, well, those are the rules. Well, those rules were never meant for people like us. So you're inviting me in and you're saying, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, then we're going to treat you the way we treat people who default for whatever reason, right? Without understanding what that is. But I think that at the institutional level, those exceptions should be built in. I think at the national level, given what we've gone through the past year and a half and the recalcitrance of some institutions, not necessarily the one this person is talking about, in deceiving the people who have come into their institutions about the kinds of futures they're going to have if they finish their program. I think as a national gesture that the current administration should forgive all those loans. If we're talking about infrastructure and the billions and trillions of dollars that we're going to do to fix the infrastructure, in my opinion, this is a part of fixing the infrastructure, giving people the opportunity to practice their professional education to make this a better country.
So I want to just turn us to a broader question as
Sure.
Our kind of final question of the night. And there's an interesting question here from another anonymous attendee who asks, I would love for Yolanda to paint us a vision of a future state that we can all join in to be a part of. Oftentimes we talk about power and dismantling systemic issues, but people end up just replacing the power dynamics with one identity or another. So what is your advice on a framework for moving into that dismantling process that doesn't just kind of swap out one powerful group for another?
Well, yes, I do understand social stratification, but that doesn't mean that there aren't checks and balances and ways that people engage with each other that are respectful. In terms of power relations in the system we have now, it is so one-sided. I mean, it allows certain people in, but for the most part, it stays the same. Now, we've seen revolutions where countries have blown up and they've started systems where, as the person says, they start out where everybody is trying to do the right thing. I think there are some models for us to look at in, we can start with like our classrooms. We can start with government in small communities. We have models of where every voice is heard. I mean, there are certain levels you get where you have to trust people who are in power, but the system of electing people to represent you is one of those ways that I think is worth preserving. And to put people there who represent individuals, not a certain type. I don't think it was a coincidence that the House of Representatives have more first-time politicians who decided to run for office because they didn't feel the government was representing them. So the extent that we have voices from all corners of this country, and they're not fettered by things like having enough money and are being backed by people who have alternative agendas, I think you're seeing some grassroots movements of people who are deciding they want to take their government back, particularly at the local level, and then the House of Representatives, obviously. But this whole pushback against voting, that is going to be a turning point. So even if we are in a democracy, everybody's not going to have a voice with 300 million people, but we can make sure that our representative form of government represents all the people. And with the shifting demographics, we're going to have people running for office who don't look like the traditional politician, but they're going to be people who care about their communities and care about making things better. So the extent to which we can support those kinds of organizations in a system that we have, the better I think we can be. Can you guys see me still?
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
I touched something. I don't know what it was.
No worries.
But anyway.
Dr. Moses, now we can't hear you.
Yeah, I don't know if that's just I thought it was my internet. Let's see. No,
Try
I can try it
unmuting
again.
again.
Yeah.
We can't hear you.
I wonder if it's an internet. It happened a couple times during the talk
That's
as
what
well.
I did.
Oh,
Oh,
now
there you go. You're back.
Oh, okay. I was saying, I think this, it says my internet connection is unstable. I think that this can work if we don't hamper the ability of people at the local level to have their voices heard. And I think we can empower people too, to feel they have that kind of control in a democracy to do this. And, you know, what we see now is a lot of faux populism. I mean, it's not populism, it's the people, small people with the small number of people who want to maintain power in an environment where they have up to this point. And they don't want to give it up.
Well, Dr. Moses, we really thank you for your insight and for sharing your wisdom with us. And we are so deeply respectful of your lifetime of scholarship and engagement and leadership. So thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. And there's a lot of work to be done for all of us, and I'm just happy to still be a part of it. Yep. So thank you for having me.
We will continue to look to you for guidance, and we welcome your support and assistance with our New York-based initiatives. We need you to build a bridge back to the East Coast and come back to your city.
Yes, I always think of New York fondly. So there's that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. And thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you to all of the participants. I would like to make a special thank you to our wonderful fellows, Anna Sergeyeva and Miriam Leitner, because without them, truly, this would be an impossible task for us. And they are our next generation of scholars. They're waiting in the wings to really help shape a more inclusive, more thoughtful, more engaged society. So we need you. Thank you so much for helping us here in the anthropology section. This concludes our 2020-2021 academic year. And we will not have programming over the summer, but we will be back in the fall. And we look forward to reconvening with you. And we look forward to welcoming so many of you back to the seminars that we hold.
And I'll just announce that our theme for next year for the 2021-2022 program is on theory and critique of forms of care, mutual aid, and charity. We've entitled that theme Emergent Care and Community, and we're going to be inviting discussion of how communities develop and deepen forms of care for one another and our environment in times of crisis or under enduring conditions of suffering. So we look forward to seeing many of you back for our talks in the fall. Thank you so much.